Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to take a look at Double Fantasy according to John Lennon's personal assistant. Double Fantasy was John Lennon's last album he made before being killed, and John Lennon's personal assistant at that time was a man named Fred Seaman. He was John Lennon's assistant for 18 months. The book he wrote about his time with John is entitled The Last Days of John Lennon, and it gives the reader an inside look into the life of John and Yoko at the end of John's life. I thought I would find out a behind-the-scenes look at Double Fantasy and how it came to be through the eyes of the assistant. So the Muses back begins it, and it is thought that the 5 years that John Lennon stayed home and became a house husband, that he didn't have any songs written, but that wasn't so. He continued to write songs during this time. He just didn't complete most of them. It was when John went on a trip to Bermuda on a small yacht. There was a powerful storm, and the yacht was pounded by 120-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves. Very scary stuff there. The captain of the yacht hadn't slept in 3 days, and he asked John to take the wheel. So John had a little bit of a sailing experience, so he agreed to do it, and he drove the boat for 6 hours. And after that harrowing ordeal, he became inspired by the muse to create music again. He was just glad to be alive after that. I bet I would be feeling the same way. So inspiration for the title Double Fantasy. According to Fred Seaman, while in Bermuda, John and the maid and Aunt Helen, who was Sean's aunt, and Frederick went to a restaurant in the Botanical Gardens. And John and Frederick went strolling down the lanes of flowers, which all had names. In the book it states, finally we came to an area planted with irises that sported the names such as Angel Wings, Purple Imperator, Bronze Queen, and White Excelsior. In one area there was freesia, where John stopped, bending low in front of a small bunch of flowers. He stared at the rectangular sign that had the words Double Fantasy engraved in white letters against a black background. Double Fantasy, he said softly. He looked pensive for a moment, then his face lit up. That's it, he exclaimed suddenly. That's the album title I've been looking for. It was the perfect title. It represented a new start for John's career, not only for John's career, but also his marriage. Okay, the songs and the new momentum. So Bermuda really got John's momentum going. He wrote new songs and completed older songs. He ordered a drum machine and then decided to create a studio. He wanted to buy a second tape recorder and a microphone, and this would be for creating 2-track demo tapes. Later, Frederick and John went to an electric store and he purchased a tape recorder, blank tapes, and headphones. John then went to the record store and wanted to get a record with a local reggae band, and the store's salesman didn't have any local groups, but said that there was some imported reggae he might like. The guy recommended a tape by a new Jamaican group called Mantubi. He got that along with recordings by Jacob Miller and Bob Marley's latest release, Uprising. When John got back to their home in Bermuda, they set up a recorder in the sunroom and he began overdubbing tapes. He added a guitar track to the piano version of Serve Yourself. Frederick said that John was delighted with the result. Then he worked on a new song about Sean entitled Beautiful Boy, and the next day he played it for Sean, and Sean was so happy he had written the song for him. Sean danced around the sunroom when he heard it, which was sweet. So John had been feeling guilty since Sean had been there in Bermuda. He hadn't spent much time with them. So they had a change of the recording room while they were in Bermuda. John decided to change rooms to do recordings. He went from the sunroom to a spare room on the second floor, and it was there that he created songs Borrowed Time, Beautiful Boy, Steppin' Out, and Serve Yourself. So he was having trouble with the new song Watching the Wheels. Originally the song was supposed to be called Watching the Flowers Grow. Frederick said that John sat at the piano to come up with the lyrics. He did this before lunch and dinner, and he played it until he went into a deep trance-like state where the missing words just came from him from above. John said the trick was to make your mind go blank, which was a prerequisite for being able to receive input from a higher power. I like that Frederick lets us see how John got his inspiration, and then he explains the details to John's writing of songs. He said John was methodical. He would construct the basic chords on the piano, while sometimes working on lyrics at the same time. When he had a rough version of the song, he would then use his guitar to refine the melody. Later he would add a rhythm, And John was good at setting up his drum machine, and he would try different ones until one clicked. And John always had a tape recorder running while he was working. He would double track his favorite demos of a song, and he combined piano, guitar, rhythm, and vocal tracks until he produced a master demo he liked. Okay, Yoko decided the album should be a double effort. John Lennon was thinking that this was going to be just him singing on the album, but Yoko got the idea that this album could rekindle her short-lived career as a rock singer. She gradually introduced the idea to John and then kept nagging at him until he agreed to let her in on it. John knew that this was going to be an album that had to be commercial to succeed. Since he had not recorded in 5 years, he knew he would be under a microscope, and he wanted Yoko's songs to be good too. Next, John was angry that Yoko wasn't creating her songs fast enough. The first night that Yoko arrived, she was making a deal on the sale of a prize Holstein cow that they owned in upstate New York, and she got $250,000 for it. John was mad that she didn't seem to be writing songs and said, if she doesn't get on the ball soon, there ain't going to be no album. And then John continued to say, she's supposed to be writing songs, checking out studios, and looking for a producer, but she's not doing anything except selling cows. So John didn't let Yoko's foot dragging stop him. He continued to work on the album. He said he felt like Paul McCartney because he was producing so much musically. And one day, John kept calling Yoko in New York and couldn't get her to answer the phone. And then he went into his room and created the song, I'm Losing You. So John decided to send Frederick, the assistant, there to see what was going on. And the day before he was to leave, Yoko called, and she didn't want Frederick to go to New York, but John made up a story that Frederick was going to be evicted from his apartment and had to go back a few days and take care of it. When Frederick got to the Yoko and John's apartment, things were a mess. The maid complained to Frederick she was overworked. Frederick ran into someone named Luciano Sparacino, who was renovating the clothes room. Frederick asked what was going on, and he shockingly said that Yoko was planning to divorce John. I guess that shouldn't have been shocking since they had been separated for 18 months. So John was to move into the next-door apartment number 71 when he got back from Bermuda, and Luciano was to move John's furniture, clothes, and stereo equipment to that apartment next door. So when Frederick returned to Bermuda, he didn't want to tell John what was going on in New York, especially the divorce part. Well, John didn't seem to ask Frederick many questions. He was being positive about Yoko. He felt that them working together would be a good way to keep their marriage from being in a rut. And one interesting thing that Frederick mentioned was that John was talking about Paul's work ethic. John said, Paul never stopped working. We'd finish one album, I'd go off and get stoned and forget about writing new stuff, but he'd want to begin recording again. I would have to scramble to come up with songs of my own. I wrote some of my best songs under that kind of pressure. So the day before John was to return to New York, Frederick found out from Luciano that Yoko changed her mind about the divorce and had moved John's stuff back to John and Yoko's apartment 72. So I wonder if John ever got wind of all that, if Yoko had mentioned anything like that to him, or if that was something Frederick found out that John had no idea about. So it's interesting to wonder about that. Recording the songs, when everyone got to the studio, Yoko and John seemed to have a bit of tension between them. John and the musicians started to jam for over an hour, and Yoko had been observing them. And then Yoko said in a shrill voice that she wanted to do one of her songs. John said, "Yes, mother dearest." John said it according to Frederick with a bit of mockery in her voice, in his voice. Yoko then asked Frederick in a whisper to get her a glass of vodka. She said she would relax her voice, but she said don't tell anybody what she was drinking, and she wanted it to make it look like she was drinking water. So John was getting into the session and didn't want to eat dinner, but since the band had worked up an appetite, he allowed them to break for dinner, which was sushi and chicken teriyaki. After dinner, John picked up his guitar and began to strum furiously, and the band got enthused over John and his getting into the song. One of the musicians, in a down moment, started to play I Want You, She's So Heavy. It was a song about Yoko, and John said, "That's the first song I wrote about her. Most of my songs are about her, you know," Frederick said. He smiled affectionately at Yoko, and Yoko responded with a frosty smile. So later, Yoko called Frederick over to say she was ready to leave, but she was too drunk to get up. Frederick got her assistant to help her to get out of the room. So John was a little bit surprised by that, and he then took a sip from Yoko's glass and shuddered. He then said, "Jesus, I didn't know what that was." So the next day, Yoko got to perform Kiss, Kiss, Kiss song. Frederick brought in the drum machine, a ghetto blaster, and some music stands. And Yoko sat at the black upright piano mumbling her lyrics, and John played the melody on the white grand piano. John didn't like how it was going, so he said the background needed a lively backbeat to compensate for the lack of melodic variety. John kept insisting that she put a fast tempo on her song, but Yoko wouldn't hear of it. At 6:30, the musicians went to the white rooms to hear Yoko at the white piano. She played bits and pieces of her songs, and to Frederick it sounded like bad nursery rhymes, but to Yoko they were masterpieces. They struggled to get through Yoko's song, "Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him," and at 10 o'clock they called it a day. Later, Frederick entered the kitchen where John and Yoko were at, and they had tea and leftover sushi. Yoko was pleased with the day's performance, but John didn't feel the same way and said to her, "Don't kid yourself, your stuff needs a lot of work." So the following days, John hadn't been ahead of a group for about 6 years, but when he got up in front of them, he immediately took charge. Some of the musicians, Slick and Newman, were anxious to impress John and look for his approval. John didn't like the drummer Newark because he was trying to be funny and kept talking, and John wasn't in the mood for idle talk. He also didn't like because the drummer Newmark took frequent trips to the bathroom. Frederick said John liked to keep the musicians on a short leash. He wanted the music done just as he wanted it done, nothing more, nothing less. John bullied, joked, cajoled, lectured, ridiculed, and insulted the musicians, anything to get them to play what he had in mind. So they performed 2 songs on Friday, John's song "Strange Days" and Yoko's "Kiss, Kiss, Kiss." It seemed like Yoko was nervous because it was said that she snorted cocaine in front of everyone before recording her number. After recording the songs, all of them went in the control room to listen to it. John seemed to be in good spirits after hearing the songs. But things got tense again on Saturday when Yoko was struggling on her reggae song "Don't Be Scared." John said something harsh to her and everyone didn't know what to say. The band was amazed at how fast John worked, but John did this for cost-cut purposes. John and Yoko didn't have a record company paying for the sessions, so it was costing them thousands of dollars a day. So no wonder John was in a bit on edge. Anybody would be spending that much money. In the book, Frederick mentions a message that George had wanted delivered to John. It said, "Please call George. He's very anxious to talk to you after an absence of 10 years. When John got the message, he said, "Well, it's kind of George to call after forgetting to mention me in his book." John gave the message back to Frederick and told him to give the note to Mother to deal with. And this shows how hurt John was that George had no mention of him in the book, "I Me Mine." It was an insult to John because he felt he had started George's career, which he had. So next they had trouble finding a record company. Yoko had trouble finding a record company to produce the tracks they created. Numerous record companies were interested, but when they found out it was an alternate tracks between her and John, they backed off. Finally, they got David Geffen and Capitol Records to do the label. He was a new producer at the time, and Geffen insisted on speaking to Yoko first and regarded her contributions as equal to Lennon's, and he signed them before listening to the tracks. So I thought I would show Double Fantasy through a different set of eyes, and no one was closer than John's assistant at the time, Fred Seaman. Even though John and Yoko were back together, it seemed like they were still trying to get used to each other again after being separated for so long. John seems to really have wanted to please Yoko, but the making of the record led to stressful moments, with John's feeling pressure to hurry and record since he and Yoko had to pay for the recording sessions himself, and anybody can understand that. But Double Fantasy seems to be an album that shows the marriage of John and Yoko, and the song showcases that moment in time when they got back together and were ready to share a future together again. And I wish they could have had that opportunity. But I hope everybody enjoyed the video. If you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And thank you to all of you who have subscribed. And if you haven't, if you could, that would be good. So I wish everybody a great day today. And tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.